Night at 10, one of the biggest military operations.
Huw Edwards is one of the most famous newsreaders in Britain.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
But for nearly a week, his name and face has been missing from the news cycle. We can now reveal he is the unnamed BBC presenter at the heart of the Sun newspaper's allegations. In the past hour, his wife, Vicky Flind, released these words. In light of the recent reporting regarding the BBC presenter, I am making this statement on behalf of my husband, Huw Edwards. After what have been 5 extremely difficult days for our family, I am doing this primarily out of concern for his mental well-being and to protect our children. Huw is suffering from serious mental health issues, as is well documented. He has been treated for severe depression in recent years. The events of the last few days have greatly worsened matters. He has suffered another serious episode and is now receiving inpatient hospital care, where he'll stay for the foreseeable future. Once well enough to do so, he intends to respond to the stories that have been published. To be clear, Huw was first told that there were allegations being made against him last Thursday. In the circumstances, and given Huw's condition, I would like to ask that the privacy of my family and everyone else caught up in these upsetting events is respected. I know that Huw is deeply sorry that so many colleagues have been impacted by the recent media speculation. We hope this statement will bring that to an end. Ever since the scandal broke last week, a sinister game of Guess Who has ensued, but this evening the presenter's wife came forward to say it's him. This follows a tumultuous week. Today the Sun newspaper claimed the presenter broke the law by meeting another young person from a dating site during the COVID lockdown. It is a story which has dominated the airwaves.
It's his decision, but he needs to come forward now, I think. I know his survival instinct has kicked in, and I know he saw what happened to Philip Schofield, but my God, look at the damage to the BBC.
Is it in the public interest or merely of interest to the public?
It is fair to say that the presenter at the heart of this is also extremely angry over a lot of the Sun coverage.
Since the scandal broke last week, there have been several young adults who claim they've had inappropriate contact with the presenter, ranging from him sending a teenager heart emojis to law-breaking. But this evening, the Metropolitan Police announced there is no information to indicate a criminal offence, while the BBC say they will now continue their internal investigation, whilst continuing to be mindful of our duty of care, they say, to all involved. Now, this is undeniably an affair which has generated lots of salacious claims in the tabloids and online. But I guess the crucial question is, if we just pause for a moment and take a step back, is there any concrete evidence that this said presenter has acted unlawfully? Now, not for want of trying, we haven't been able to personally verify the claims that a crime has been committed. And if it hasn't, it begs the question that is this simply now a private matter? The Sun say their story is undisputedly in the public interest. The newspaper argues here is a powerful household name with a handsome salary funded by licence fee payers, allegedly paying a vulnerable young person with a history of drug abuse for explicit photos. That now 20-year-old says the allegations are, quote, rubbish. While Huw Edwards has remained silent as the storm around him swirls, his wife said this evening she hopes this statement will bring an end to the noise and speculation.
And Minnie joins me now. Minnie, take us through the sequence of events here.
Well, Kathy, it's been a dramatic hour and an astonishing few days, if I'm honest. We've known who the presenter is for days now. His name has been swirling around newsrooms, but due to a combination of privacy and defamation laws, people have not been naming the presenter. But minutes after that, the Met have announced that no criminal offence has been committed. Now, his wife, Vicky Flind, has sensationally named her husband on his behalf. As you heard in my report, she said, due to his mental health deteriorating, the presenter has been hospitalised. Now, in a remarkable statement, she says, I am making this statement on behalf of my husband, Huw Edwards. After 5 extremely difficult days for our family, I'm doing this primarily out of concern for his mental well-being and to protect our children. She goes on to say Huw is suffering from serious mental health issues, as is well documented. He has been treated for severe depression in recent years. The events of the last few days, she says, have been greatly worsened matters. He has suffered another serious episode and is now receiving inpatient hospital care, where he'll stay, she says, for the foreseeable future. Now, Huw Edwards is, of course, a man who now needs no introduction. He has worked for the BBC for 4 decades. He is the presenter who announced the death of the Queen, the face of their royal and election coverage. But the Sun newspaper claims he is also the man at the centre of this scandal. Now, this has all happened so quickly that even his own channel, BBC News, wrongly announced he'd resigned from his job before having to correct themselves live on air. Back to you.
Thanks, Minnie.
Thanks, Minnie. Well, earlier I spoke to Roger Bolton, who worked for 50 years as a producer, editor and presenter at the BBC and now hosts the Beeb Watch podcast. I began by asking him what he makes of this evening's developments.
I think this behoves, first of all, the Sun newspaper to explain itself. It's been asking the BBC to publish details, but it's not published the details itself of its investigation. We need to know a lot from the Sun newspaper now about what its evidence was and what it's done. Secondly, I think the MPs in Parliament who called for, immediately, called for the naming of the presenter should really think about what they were doing and the dangers on individuals in this case of leaping to judgment. And I think we in the media have to ask ourselves, how well have we done in this story? We had to report it, but have we overdone it? I would say about the BBC, by the way, I think it has been commendably open and honest about its reporting, although there is a danger it became a little self-obsessed in the end and went too far. We all, you know, it's a classic sort of example of not rushing to judgment.
In many ways, a very, very sad statement from Vicky Flind, the wife of Huw Edwards. She said it's well known that he has documented mental health issues and that the events of the last few days have greatly worsened matters. He suffered another serious episode, is now said to be in hospital receiving inpatient treatment. I mean, give us a sense of the figure that Huw Edwards is in terms of the BBC.
Well, I think in many ways Huw Edwards was the face of BBC, certainly BBC News, BBC Elections. I think he inspired a great deal of trust. I think that trust was deserved. I think as a journalist, he's a fine journalist. I think we've always got to be careful when we're sort of running some of these stories that some people are not mentally very healthy, and that we've got to be very careful in what we say about it. Otherwise, there will be tragedies.
I suppose the events of the last few days have completely exposed a question that is very difficult to answer. Lots of talk over the last few days, you know, the public have a right to know, balanced up against a high-profile figure's expectation of privacy.
The public has a right to know in most circumstances, but it doesn't have to know immediately. There are a whole range of processes that should be gone through. We shouldn't be rushing to judgment. We shouldn't be rushing to publish names. You know, you've got to weigh up the right to privacy against the public interest. And I think in this instance, there is no reason to doubt that the police seriously looked at this case and to see whether it was worth investigating for criminal activity. There's no doubt in my mind that the BBC is doing an extremely thorough examination of the issues involved. And I think we need to know, but we don't need to know now and immediately when the facts are not clear. What we do need to know is what was the Sun doing, publishing all these allegations, not carrying initially at least the denial of them. A lot of questions should be asked of the Sun newspaper now.
And over the last few days they have been missing from this conversation. Should the editor of the Sun now come out and answer some of those questions?
The Sun must come out and answer for the position it's taken. The important thing is the public in the end knows exactly what has happened, when it happened. But it may not be that the public should know now.
But on the whole, in terms of damage to the BBC?
We've had in the past with the BBC institutional cover-ups. This was never an institutional cover-up. We have had scandals in relation to investigations where people have done things they shouldn't have done. You're thinking of Martin Bashir. This was never, ever a massive BBC scandal. It was largely exaggerated. But the BBC it was a test for the BBC. My personal view, and I've often been a critic of the organisation, is that on the whole it comes out of this very well. But overall, this is a tragedy, and there's not just the presenter, of course. There still is the tragedy for the family originally involved. Please, please, I say to the rest of the media leave that family alone to work out its issues, its problems.
Roger Bolton, thank you very much for talking to us today. Thank you. Well, we have been trying to ask the Sun some of those questions posed over the last few days, but their response so far has been no comment. Cathy.
Well, I'm joined now by Alistair Campbell, journalist and former Downing Street Director of Strategy and Communications under Tony Blair, who interviewed Huw Edwards about mental health. Alistair Campbell, I just wondered if you could reflect for a moment just what the significance of Huw Edwards being named is tonight.
Well, Huw Edwards is a big, big figure within the BBC, and if you were to name half a dozen people that would be identified as the face of the BBC, Huw Edwards would be one of them. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Sun has been pursuing this story and trying to, to bring him down, because it's about a bigger battle where the right-wing newspapers want to do down the BBC. And I do think
what you see going on here?
I think it's definitely part of it. And interestingly there, when you say that, we've asked the Sun to come on, that's not how they operate. They have their own agenda, they pursue their own agenda and their own stories relentlessly. And I think, I agree with a lot of what Roger Bolton said there, but I do think the BBC has slightly played into the hands of the Sun on this one, because frankly, honestly, I think most people from outside the UK watching our media over the last few days just think we've become a bit of a ridiculous country. You've got the NATO summit going on, you've got a mortgage crisis, you've got a former Prime Minister refusing to hand over his phone in defiance of a High Court order, and you'd think there was only one thing happening in the country.
OK, let me just put back to you what the Sun have said, because they say that all the way along they've been reporting the concerns of parents trying to stop payments to a vulnerable child funding a life-risking drug habit, and they've said that this story was always in the public interest. And add to that, it's not just the Sun reporting on this story, the BBC has reported on allegations of its own about inappropriate behaviour.
I'm not saying that it's not a story. I'm not saying that it's not something worthy of reporting and investigation. I'm talking about the complete loss of any sense of perspective that we get. And let's be absolutely frank, the idea that the Sun sits there as some kind of social worker looking after the interests and welfare of parents, they want a big story about a big name within the BBC who in their eyes has done wrong. And I just think that when you actually track back, as I think Minnie did in her reporting of this, you track back to what's actually happened. So the police have investigated this. Why did the police investigate it? Because there was a great media furore. Why was there a great media furore? Because the media created a great media furore. Right. The police now say there's no, so far as they can see, there's no crime that has been committed. So it then becomes a story about somebody's personal life.
OK, but so let's pause there for a second, because if you were still at the Mirror and someone had come along with a similar story about a public figure on the right, for example, maybe a right-wing presenter or a right-wing MP, would you have put this down page?
Well, look, the tabloid papers, and as you say, I used to work for one, as I say, are always interested in this kind of story. But we're talking here about something which has led every news bulletin for the last 5-6 days. It's a complete loss of perspective.
Is it also an invasion of privacy, do you think?
Well, there's no doubt about that at all. And I think that this sort of guessing game that's been going on over the last few days, and you even have a paper like the Mail does a national opinion poll, pays a polling company to find out how many people in the country knew the name before it was made public. And then you have a Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak comments on it, Suella Braverman comments on it. The whole thing has become an absurd witch hunt in a way. And look, as you say, I've talked to Huw Edwards before about his mental health. I'm well aware that he's got a history of pretty severe depression at times. And I think anybody who reads that statement from his wife, and people who know his wife, I don't know his wife well at all, but those I've seen commenting on who she is and what kind of person she is, you're now talking about somebody who is in hospital, who is, everybody knows in the media, has had mental health issues for some time. And what you'll see, you won't see the Sun coming out and defending themselves. You'll see their front page tomorrow. You'll see the rest of the papers all now sort of covering Huw Edwards as though it's some kind of obituary. And I hope the media will actually look at themselves a bit in the coverage of this story, how they've actually been part of the story, and just understand there is so much else going on in the world that is more important, of more genuine interest, I believe, to a lot more people around the country and around the world.
I mean, as you say, you have talked to him about his mental health. You've had your own mental health struggles yourself. I wondered if you could just give us a sense of how difficult, what he'll be going through, really, at this point.
Well, I think it's impossible for any one person to speak of somebody else's mental health. But what I do know is that I've had bouts of depression at a time when I've been very, very high profile. And put it this way, it doesn't help. I think if you're struggling anyway, I think to have yourself being talked about, written about, criticised, whacked from all sides, and you've got children, and you've got a family that you're, I assume, trying to hold together, then I think it becomes very, very difficult. And I just wish people could understand that when these media frenzies happen, I've been the centre of a few media frenzies in my time, when they happen, it's so important that the people at the centre of them understand that most people out there are a lot more reasonable than the people writing newspapers for the papers like The Sun.
Just finally, the BBC appears to be in some disarray almost in its reporting of this tonight. You know, they announced he'd resigned and then they retracted it. How big a crisis do you think this is now in the coming days for the BBC?
I don't believe it is. I don't think it's on a par with some of the crises that they've had before, and some of which I was, very central to. I think that the BBC actually at the start of this handled it very, very well. They, unlike papers like The Sun and the Mail, they covered their own story in a professional and reasonable way. I think they then got caught up with the whole frenzy. I think now they should actually, in a way, lead the way in saying, the police have said there's nothing to investigation, we carry on our internal investigation. Other than that, it's a matter for us, and above all, it's a matter for Huw Edwards and his family, and the rest of you, frankly, can go get lost.
Alistair Campbell, thanks very much.
Thank you.